Hello and welcome to Noblemind.
Noblemind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello, friends of Noblemind. The time has come for us to officially announce that our new Noblemind Facebook community has officially launched. We are excited to help you learn more from each episode with extra resources and discussion, as well as bring meaningful insights into your practice and your everyday life. To join the group, you can go to noblemindpodcast.com and follow the link over to Facebook. Or if you already follow us on Facebook, you can find the group link on our homepage. Alex and I are looking forward to seeing you there.
This week, we speak to Dr. Anthony Zanesco about his meditation research and the potential impacts of long-term meditation on cognitive and emotional processes. He talks about the differences between mind wandering, spontaneous thought, and rumination, as well as his work exploring microstates. Dr. Zanesco is a cognitive neuroscientist who studies attention and mind wandering. He completed his PhD in psychology under Dr. Clifford Saran at UC Davis. He's currently a postdoctoral associate in the laboratory of Dr. Amishi Jha in the psychology department at the University of Miami. If you enjoy our show, we'd love for you to leave us a review or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can learn about upcoming events, get our show notes, and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We're here with Dr. Tony Zanesco, who's a postdoctoral researcher, has done some fascinating work, has worked on the Shamatha project. Welcome. Would you like to tell us about yourself and your work?
Hi, Kate and Alex. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. My name is Dr. Anthony Zanesco. I typically go by Tony. I'm a postdoctoral associate at the University of Miami, working with Dr. Amishi Jha in her laboratory. I've been at the University of Miami for about 4 years now, since 2018. And the work we do in that lab mainly involves basic science, attention and cognition. We study mind wandering as well as intervention research, looking at how mindfulness interventions might benefit people's attention and focus. I did my PhD at the University of California, Davis, working with Cliff Saran on this large scale meditation intervention study known as the Shamatha project, which is maybe something we'll talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Maybe we could hear a little bit more about kind of what inspires your work. How'd you end up in this very interesting role? Are you a practitioner yourself, or?
Yeah, so my kind of interest in this world goes back to my time as an undergraduate, first at UC Davis, where I started getting interested in mindfulness and meditation practice on a personal level. And that kind of intersected with my studies and a chance encounter with my then future PhD mentor, Cliff Saran. So I bumped into him kind of by chance in a coffee shop. I was reading a book on Buddhist contemplative practice, and he noticed that and struck up a conversation.
Wow.
If you've ever met Cliff, he's the kind of person to chat up strangers all the time. So
I can't say I've ever had as good of an outcome from a chat in a coffee shop.
Yeah. So at that time, he had just gotten the first chunk of money to start this really crazy, large, ambitious project that we've come to call the Shamatha project, which ended up being a 3-month-long study looking at practitioners undergoing a 3-month-long meditation retreat. He had just gotten this large chunk of money to start up his lab and start working on this project, and so he needed research assistance at that time. So I ended up volunteering my time as an undergraduate in his lab, working on this project, different aspects of the project. And I was able to see that project through. I finished up my undergraduate degree and ended up working with him as a post-bachelor's research assistant for a few years before going on to be doing my PhD with him as well. Kind of broadly, my time over that time was kind of broadly working on the Shamatha project in different aspects.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good time to tell us a little bit more about what that Shamatha project is, kind of bigger picture.
Yeah. So the Shamatha project was this large longitudinal intervention study that was conceived first as a way of looking at how the effects of long-term dedicated practice might change aspects of cognition, emotion, aspects of brain processing, and health-related biology. And the way we kind of planned to do this was to look at practitioners who would go through a 3-month-long meditation retreat. So if any of your listeners have sat a retreat, you know that this is a period of dedicated meditation practice where you might devote 6 to 10 hours of your day to kind of focus practice. And in this case, we had 60 participants. So 30 of them were assigned to our training group who did the first 3-month retreat. The study took place at Shambhala Mountain Center in Colorado. We kind of took one of the dormitories there and built 2 university-grade laboratories in the basement of these dormitories.
So this is like one of the traditional 3-month retreats that are done in many schools of Buddhism. Did you augment the schedule in any way for people, or?
The teacher for this retreat was Alan Wallace, who's a prominent Buddhist author and teacher, translator for the Dalai Lama, very accomplished practitioner himself. So he led these retreats. He's also been kind of a participant in the dialogue between science and Buddhist contemplatives for many years now. So he's kind of familiar with our end of things from like the research perspective as well. So he can kind of serve as that intermediary. So he led these 3-month retreats. But from that end, it was a kind of a traditional retreat. Participants met twice daily to practice as a group, but primarily they practiced on their own within their own kind of rooms. You might have sat some retreats where there's a lot of group practice. This was more of a solitary kind of situation.
Got it. Okay.
And it was mostly shamatha training plus qualities of the heart, like loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity.
That's exactly right. Yes, correct.
And the shamatha focused on mindfulness of breathing, observing mental events, awareness of awareness.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
One question is, around when was this initial study? And, any of those initial findings, and then we'll get into what's come of it from there.
Yeah, so the study took place in 2007. So it's quite a long time ago. I actually pulled up, your listeners can't see, but I have now the summer copy of Buddha Dharma from 2006. And we have one of our ads in the magazine where we put different ads in magazines and different retreat centers trying to recruit participants. So we ended up getting about 120 participants willing to participate in the project. We whittled those down to 60. 30 sat the first 3-month retreat. 30 participated as a control group. Mm-hmm. So we flew them in to Shambhala Mountain Center to act as a control comparison condition for the first 3-month retreat. And then those control participants later did their own 3-month retreat as well. So we can compare those participants to themselves when they're not undergoing this retreat period to when they're then sitting their own 3-month retreat.
So it's a very practiced group. It's people who can get away for 3 months or 6 months from life or what have you. But it's also folks who've been doing this for a long time. So that's really like a beautiful opportunity, because a lot of studies on meditation tend to look at, people who are new and just getting instruction or something. And this study is looking at people over the long term who are really deeply into practice.
Yeah, that's right. It raises a really interesting point about research in this domain. And in our particular case here, you can't just take someone off the street and ask them to do a 3-month retreat or to practice the kinds of amount that we were interested in looking at. So you already need people who have some sort of daily practice themselves, some sort of experience with practice, for them to be able to go through this very rigorous intervention. But yeah, like you mentioned, a lot of the research out there is on novices with very short programs.
And the findings of the overall shamatha projects are really remarkable, impressive findings.
Yeah, so I mentioned that these studies took place in 2007 and 2008. And since then, we've had a lot of years to kind of analyze different aspects of the project. But let me talk a little bit about kind of some of the experiments that we ran, some of the data we collected. So I had mentioned we built these laboratories in the basement of the dormitories at Shambhala Mountain Center. These were primarily so that we can have a controlled laboratory situation to have our participants sit down and complete different tests of their attention and memory and their focus, and for us to record brain electrical activity during these different experiments. So we had a whole bunch of different tasks of attention, some tasks that looked at their emotional responding. We showed them emotionally provocative images and videos and recorded their brain responses and physiological responses to these stimuli. And we recorded brain electrical activity through EEG during these tasks, as well as during periods of meditation, compassion, breath-focused shamatha practice or mindfulness of breathing practice, a compassion meditation practice, as well as periods of rest where they're just sitting there with their eyes closed, not doing anything in particular. Some of the main kind of findings we've seen was generally that their attentional abilities were kind of improved over the course of the 3-month retreat. One of the experiments we gave them was a sustained attention task, what is typically known as a continuous performance task, where we're asking you to pay attention to stimuli that appear on the screen one at a time over long periods of time. In this case, you're seeing short lines that appear on the screen. And sometimes those lines are a little bit longer than shorter lines that are just a little bit shorter. So your job during this task is to click the button on the mouse whenever you see one of these short lines, but they only appear 10% of the time. So you're sitting here for 30 minutes watching these lines pop up, and you have to be very attentive to the lines to be able to tell the difference between these long and short lines. So this is one way in cognitive psychology that people study people's sustained attention ability. So we can look at what is known as the Vigilance Decrement, which is essentially how fast your performance declines over the course of this time, which is kind of inevitable that people have a kind of a decline in performance. They get worse and worse at detecting these lines, in this particular case, over the course of the task.
So it's a task that would be quite boring potentially,
Absolutely,
and also and require you to sort of force yourself to focus on something that's rather boring. And as a clinician myself, I'm aware that this kind of test is used as part of a diagnostic workup for people with ADHD. So just to help our listeners kind of contextualize that, we're looking at attention, and although you weren't specifically looking at ADHD, it's a similar sort of test.
Yeah, absolutely. There are variants that are used in diagnosing individuals with ADHD. Some of this research originally comes from early work with the military in World War II, when they're interested in how radar operators might miss little blips on their radar, because those would be really important in aircraft. And so they would find that radar operators would often make these kinds of attentional lapses. So that's kind of where that research originated.
Fascinating. So what did our meditators do?
Yeah, so they were generally better at detecting these short lines from the long. They were able to actually distinguish the short and long lines to a better degree, kind of indicative of greater perceptual processing of those stimuli. They were able to notice finer differences between the long and short lines. And their performance actually declined less over time compared to the control group. So they had a kind of a flatter decline in performance over time. Whereas the individuals who acted as the control group, who weren't undergoing the 3-month retreat at that moment, they would get worse and worse and worse to a greater degree than the training participants.
So they were able to notice better when something unusual appeared. And also they were able to inhibit their habitual responses, which, right?
Yeah, that's a nice way to phrase it. Yeah. So essentially there's these very odd events, which are these short lines that appear, and they were able to notice those when they pop up to a greater degree. We also did the reverse of this task, where they're clicking the button every time they see the long line. And for those short lines, they withhold their response. And so we also saw that their performance was better in those tasks. They were better able to withhold their response when those short lines popped up. So that task better measures their ability to inhibit kind of these habitual responses as well. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin of how we've studied sustained attention in these practitioners. And from those pair of tasks, we saw that their kind of ability to sustain their attention over time was improved.
It seems like you were comparing them, one group against themselves, as well as a group against a control group. So were they performing better relative to their selves 3 months ago when they were, sitting around waiting for their retreat to start? Or were they better compared to like a control group versus, a different group of people, or both?
Correct. Yeah. So in the first retreat, the participants undergoing the 3-month retreat were compared to the control group, and there they better. But then when that control group then sits their own 3-month retreat, they perform better than themselves.
So, and these are all accomplished meditators. So there's something about being in that retreat and meditating at that level that enhances its capacity even more than wherever they were at their baseline, which I don't know if you looked at that, but arguably they were already benefiting from, being long-term practitioners.
Yes, absolutely. How I like to think about it is exercise as kind of an analogy. So you might have someone who regularly runs to get their exercise. And so they have, a daily habit of doing exercise. They might benefit from doing that exercise over time. The benefit is going to plateau, and they won't necessarily improve their time on their mile or their overall endurance and things like that. They're going to have to start pushing themselves to kind of improve the time on their mile or gain better endurance. So you might think about like an Olympic athlete and how much they have to dedicate to their sport. And for them to be able to maintain that level of performance requires a whole lot of effort. If they start just scaling back and doing a little bit of exercise here and there, they're going to lose some of those benefits over time. So there's some interesting questions about meditation practice and how those benefits accrue over time and how those benefits are lost over time when you scale back or stop practicing.
As a runner on a plateau at the moment, that's a very good, a very good metaphor. Thank you.
One of the projects that I had my direct hands on was looking at some of the brain responses during this sustained attention task. And so we corroborated some of these findings with some of the brain electrical recordings showing that the practitioners on the 3-month retreat had better perceptual processing of these lines when they were shown. And we saw some electrophysiological markers corroborating these changes in sustained attention as well.
That's great. So, and along with the sustained attention, what other outcomes did you have or did you find?
Yeah. So, in the emotional domain, one of the experiments we did was we showed highly provocative movies of human suffering, very hard movies to watch. We often do this kind of thing in psychology. Some of the other ways that psychologists might study these things are delivering electric shocks, or there's something that's called the cold pressor test, where you ask participants to hold their hand in a bucket of ice water. Kind of in the emotional domain, people tend to use images and films that might be distressing. But we were interested in how these cultivation of these qualities of the heart, compassion practice, loving kindness practice, which were a component of this 3-month retreat, might benefit or change how the practitioners reacted to these emotional movies. And what we found was that practitioners after the 3-month retreat compared to the control group actually expressed more facial expressions of sadness in response to the films and fewer expressions of anger, contempt, and disgust in reaction to the films. Because in these films in these distressing films, we showed not only the victims of suffering, but also some of the perpetrators of suffering. So someone watching those films might be very angry at the consequences or the perpetrators of the situations in those films as well. But we found that the practitioners expressed more sadness and fewer expressions of anger, contempt, and disgust. And what we did was we actually had a hidden camera in the room where we were recording their facial expressions. And we used a system known as the facial expression coding system, which was developed by Paul Ekman, kind of a famous psychologist who studied facial expression behavior. And we actually coded their facial expressions in response to these films. And so that's how we looked at that.
And they didn't know they were being recorded, so they weren't on their best behavior. It was sort of as naturalistic as you could, seeing how people respond.
Yeah, to the best of our ability, we kept the camera hidden.
So you're looking at how people are reacting to distress. Are they being judgmental about the person causing it? How quickly can they recover? What sort of mind states are they experiencing as they make contact with distressing experience?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we're trying to quantify that through their overt facial expression behavior. And so that's complicated, right? Because someone may have a very complex experience and not show it on their face. And so we're missing that information. So one of the things that we also did was we asked them about their self-reported experience. We asked them, what were you feeling at different moments in this film? So we presented them like a short storyboard, and they would indicate moments in the film, kind of reflect back on their experience, indicate moments in the film when they had particular experiences, emotional experiences. And one of the things we saw was that both the control and the training group didn't really differ in terms of their self-reported experience. They both said that they generally felt sympathetic towards the victims in the film, or angry at certain parts of the film when the perpetrators were shown, or so on and so forth. But what distinguished them was their overt behavior, where we saw that the training participants, expressed their emotions differently on their face. And we found differences in the correlation between their self-reported experience and their behavior.
I think you also found, did you find that some people had more pleasant compassion response in the face of suffering and others more fight, flight, freeze? Is that accurate?
In terms of their self-reported experience, we saw that the people who reported a lot of sympathy were the ones who reported more sadness. So there was some sort of, but only for the training group. So for them, those sad expressions, we were really kind of able to point in the direction of this being kind of a compassionate sadness. That was what is appearing to them. What you may be referring to is kind of one of the other experiments that we did, and very similar, but in this case, we just showed static images. And we looked at their physiological responses to the presentation of these static images. And in that case, when you're shown something kind of frightening or threatening, you have an immediate physiological response through skin conductance or heart rate that we can assess. And we saw differences in responses in these physiological measures. So we actually didn't see any differences between groups in terms of their responses to threatening images. So when we showed them snakes or spiders, there weren't any differences. But when we were showing them images of human suffering and distressing images, we saw differences there as well. So it seems like the training here, while the effects that we saw were really kind of specific to this interpersonal human social domain, where really focused on the suffering aspect that you might expect from the training itself. Practicing daily compassion and loving kindness for others might be expected to affect how you're going to respond to seeing those things.
So it's sounding like, I'm going to try to summarize this a little, and I'm also thinking about people interested in meditation and, or this perception of meditation as a way to blunt emotion, or a way to kind of check out, or this expectation that if you meditate, you don't have feelings, or you're distancing yourself from emotion, or I don't know. There's a lot of misunderstandings around what mindfulness does and how it helps. And it's sounding like what you're saying is that maybe it's, for these people, they're still experiencing fear in response to scary things like snakes and whatnot. And there's still an emotional response that's evoked from these images of human suffering and whatnot. But the emotional quality is different. It's not as physiologically or physiological reactivity, and not as anger / disgust / contempt, and more of the sort of tender emotional quality. So am I getting that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's also interesting too, because like we've mentioned, these were very dedicated practitioners. Many of them were a part of this study and came to this study with very deeply held kind of religious or spiritual belief. Many of them were dedicated practitioners of Buddhism. And so they come with different ethical, spiritual worldviews kind of already built in. So I think in the world, a lot of people come to a mindfulness practice from different perspectives, different worldviews, or for different reasons. Someone might come for trying to gain a little more presence in their daily life or reduce stress in their daily life. That's, I think, a door for a lot of practitioners into this world. But I think the motivations here for these participants on average were maybe a little different in that they see this as a deep part of their worldview practice and commitments to a lot of those other angles, trying to reduce suffering in the world through practice, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Your research aims to understand the dynamics of attention, mind wandering, and spontaneous thought, which is fascinating. I wonder if you could tell us.
Yeah, so my work kind of looking at contemplative practice, mindfulness, and meditation kind of drew me into this whole world of research on mind wandering. I think mind wandering is central to contemplative practice. When you first do a mindfulness practice or you try to sit quietly and close your eyes and pay attention to your breath, you'll quickly find that your attention is caught up on thoughts that kind of run away with itself.
And it quickly leads many people to think they can't meditate because their mind wanders.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I got really interested in this kind of process of this phenomenon of mind wandering. And I really think that it's central to human cognition as well. You know, our thoughts say a lot about who we are as people. Why is it that we have such a hard time trying to stay in the present moment and pay attention to the things that we maybe think are important without our thoughts dragging us away from that? Where do our thoughts come from? Why those particular thoughts? Mm-hmm. So I think that these are really important questions that are at the center of human psychology, and it really intersects with contemplative practice very deeply as well. There's this metaphor of the monkey mind, which is very familiar to mindfulness practitioners as well, that kind of describes how our minds frequently jump from one topic to another. And this kind of describes mind wandering very nicely.
Could you maybe just differentiate some of these terms a little for us? Mind wandering, spontaneous thought. I know maybe rumination is relevant too.
There's a lot of debate in academic research on what we might find mind wandering as or distinguish mind wandering from different aspects of thought. And I'm not sure that this is going to be easily resolved, but I like to take a broad kind of definition of mind wandering. And what happens when our attention wanders away from something that we're trying to focus on. So it's that moment when you're in a mindfulness practice where you are paying attention to your breath, but then you find yourself caught up in thoughts.
Got it. So like you've left the room somewhere, you're thinking about work, you're thinking about groceries, you're sort of wandered off. It's an evocative term. Yeah.
I kind of focus on that definition because a lot of my research involves looking at human attention in the context of tasks that we give participants to do in a kind of goal-directed way. So it's easy in that context to define mind wandering as when you're not doing the task, you're caught up in thoughts. So, But there's also this other kind of aspect of mind wandering where we can think about just kind of the wandering of our minds from thought to thought that kind of occurs when we're daydreaming or not doing anything in particular, and our thoughts just kind of come and go. So some researchers are really more interested in that aspect of mind wandering, where not so much the contrasting it with performance on some goal-directed task, but really what's happening when we're just kind of going from thought to thought. And so another kind of way to think about that is in the context of spontaneous thoughts. So you might be sitting down to try to solve math problems or planning out what's for dinner tomorrow. That is maybe more directed. So you might have like more directed thinking versus in contrasting with spontaneous thought, where you're just kind of letting your mind drift and free associate and daydream.
So while you're sitting with your cup of tea and staring out the window or showering or driving, and your mind is just kind of la 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 onto whatever, one thing after the next, going anywhere in particular.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
In one of your YouTube presentations, you have this amazing 3D model that looks at meta-awareness, object orientation, de-reification, which are all very interesting for meditators, but also the distinction between rumination versus mind wandering.
Yeah, of course. So this 3D model that Alex is referring to comes from a collaborative paper by both of my mentors. So Dr. Clifford Sarin and Dr. Amishi Jha wrote this paper, and Antoine Lutz and John Dunn. They wrote this paper in 2015, kind of trying to sidestep some of the academic debate about defining mindfulness, because there's been a lot of discussion about what exactly is mindfulness and how do we study that in the lab. And when we give people questionnaires, what do we mean by the constructs that we're trying to measure? So they're trying to sidestep that debate a little bit in this paper that they wrote, and instead trying to think about mindfulness from the perspective of these different phenomenological qualities, like what is the experience of mindfulness, and can we define it that way and map it to different brain structures and so on, and try to proceed in maybe a different way. In this little space, in this 3D diagram, they put different states of mind in there as kind of reference points for these different qualities. And one of the points they have in there is mind wandering, which is a highly variable state that they're putting there as, your mind is wandering from thought to thought, or perhaps away from the task that you're trying to focus on. So it's a very variable state, a very unstable state. Your attention isn't focused in one point over time. It fluctuates over time. And they contrast that with rumination, which they indicate in this space as being a very stable state. So one of the ways I think about rumination is when you're kind of stuck on the same train of thought, or stuck in the same train of thought over and over, and you can't let go of those thoughts. So you may not be able to let go of your thoughts during kind of an episode of mind wandering or spontaneous thought. But what would contrast them is that the content in an episode of daydreaming might drift from one topic to another. But in contrast, when you're ruminating, you're stuck on the same thing and you can't let that same thing go. Like maybe an awful event in the past, or something dumb you said in public, or so on.
So I'm going to try a metaphor here. So mind, I'm imagining like we're in a garden, and mind wandering is you're just wandering around the garden. Oh, look, a flower. Oh, look, a tree. Oh, look, a bush. Oh, look, a yellow flower. How does this one smell? Just kind of wandering around. Or, as you're saying, kind of like you're trying to stay on the path in the garden, but then you end up elsewhere, something like that. Rumination would be like, I'm just stuck on this one tree. I can't get away. Like I just am stuck focusing on this one part of the garden. Like I'm just circling around the same thought over and over, the same idea. Is that kind of?
Yeah, correct. That's how I kind of think about them. And there may be very similar processes involved here in why these thoughts come kind of unbidden into our experience, why the same kinds of thoughts keep popping up. And whereas in other cases, maybe different thoughts kind of pop up and occupy our experience. So the same kind of processes may be involved in both, but they have this different quality. And whereas rumination can be very emotionally challenging and can be difficult to kind of deal with, mind wandering has kind of a positive and a negative aspect to it as well, and can be neutral.
In meditation, the mind wandering is used by teachers a lot. Rumination, perhaps less so, in my experience. In the Vipassana department, sort of like we actually want to get to know what our minds do. What are the patterns? And then, like one experience I've had is like when my mind wanders from the object, it's frequently about a sort of a negative core belief related.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think a lot of people have that experience. Different thoughts can have different kind of power over our attention to capture, pull us around. Negative thoughts are very powerful. And I think that one of the core aspects of mindfulness practice is getting to know those thoughts and kind of reducing their hold over your attention in some way, so that we can have really negative thought might come out of nowhere and we can acknowledge that and let that go and not have it put us off course.
Yeah, as you're both talking, it's making me think about these sort of negative thoughts or rumination, which has that negative quality of being sort of stuck on thinking about something that has a sort of unpleasant emotional valence to it, but that it is kind of an unwanted attention. So you're being very attentive, but to something very upsetting potentially, or, that is, sort of distressing, or as you're saying, Alice, like a pattern of thinking, like a tendency to interpret things a certain way or be like, and how did I mess that up? And how did I mess up? So it's negative, but it feels, I'm just, as we're talking, realizing it's very much an unwanted focus, right? As opposed to wandering off elsewhere. You've wandered away from the mindfulness practice, but you've wandered into something that now you're stuck focused on that you don't want to be focusing on.
Yeah, and I think that big aspect is some sort of cognitive agency and where we want to be directing our attention in any particular moment in time, and whether we're able to achieve that and whether our thoughts are knocking off course of that. So if we're sitting quietly at the window with our cup of tea, often pleasant daydreamings, maybe we don't want to be, we're fine in that moment, not being in the present moment, being kind of stuck in our thoughts. But in the context of a very attention demanding task or in the middle of traffic when we're driving, maybe we shouldn't be daydreaming. We should be focused on the road, and that same kind of pleasant thoughts can be very problematic in that moment in time. But this can also be true of negative thoughts that pop up and drag us away, that sometimes this can be very detrimental, but sometimes also positive. There's a lot of research on the benefits of mind wandering in terms of creativity, and a lot of good ideas come to me when I'm, supposed to be working on something else. And mind wandering occurs kind of in conflict with our goals in any particular moment in time. And practitioners of mindfulness, or if you're trying to cultivate mindfulness through a practice, you're trying to be a little more in the present moment, a little more attentive, a little more in control of your attention, and maybe a little less caught up in thoughts on average over time. But I don't think you want to necessarily get rid of mind wandering or daydreaming altogether, because there are these good aspects as well.
Yeah, and I'm thinking sometimes when I'm talking to somebody who's new to meditation, they're sort of thinking, well, am I just supposed to be in the present moment all the time? Like, don't I need to plan my dinner or for retirement or, so as you're saying, having that agency over your thinking and choosing when you want to focus on, planning, some future activity, or as we're saying, let your mind wander and daydream and let those creative ideas arise or something, versus when you're choosing to do something more present focused and engaging in a meditation practice. But the practices help you have more of that agency over that.
That's exactly right. So during a mindfulness practice, we learn to recognize when we've drifted into thoughts and return our attention back. And this process of recognition and maintaining awareness of our current, of the contents of our ongoing experience and reorienting attention and keeping it where we want it to. These are all skills that we practice in mindfulness practice or meditation practice.
You've studied microstates. I wonder if you can define what is that?
Yeah, one of the areas of my research is looking at brain dynamics. And I mentioned a little bit about my work looking at brain electrical recordings using EEG. EEG, for your listeners, is a system of recording brain electrical activity using little sensors that are attached to your scalp. And what we're essentially doing is recording the summed activity of all the neural activity that's going on at any moment in time in your brain. And so all that electrical activity propagates in different ways from your brain through your skull onto your scalp, and we can pick that up with these little sensors. And we have to turn the gain all the way up so that we can hear those little tiny, that very quiet electrical activity. But we're able to do that. One of the things you'll immediately notice when you start to record brain activity is that some of that activity is not just random patterns. There's oscillations in the recordings, and it's never quiet. There's always stuff going on. So people have been interested in this spontaneous activity since they first started recording electrical activity, almost 80, 90 years now. and trying to understand what is all this stuff going on when we just ask people to sit here, because your brain is never quiet. There's always activity going on. And so one of the ways of looking at this spontaneous activity is through these EEG microstates. And they're essentially, when you map the voltage of this electrical activity onto the scalp, there's consistent patterns that pop up that each reflect neural events that are kind of synchronized in time. And so about 4 to 7 of these patterns occupy about 80% of the EEG recordings that you can get when you're looking at the spontaneous activity. So what that looks like is that the global EEG can be reduced into a series of these neural events. And it's kind of like an alphabet of about 4 to 7 letters. So the EEG microstates, well, the EEG we can record is essentially like sequences of these neural events.
The microstates are like, how many are there within a second?
Yeah, so these are very short events. They last about 30 to 120 milliseconds. So about 10 of these microstates will occur in a second. So they're very rapid, very fast, and they cycle between each other. So microstate A might be present for 30 milliseconds, and then microstate B might be present for 60 milliseconds, and then microstate C for 100, and then microstate A again, and so on. And so some of my work is really interested in understanding why these microstates occupy so much of the EEG recording, why they're such a prominent feature of human EEG. The question is whether they're important for human cognition, whether we can map them to things like your attentional state or awareness or consciousness, the contents of your ongoing experience, and trying to understand whether there are regularities or patterns in how these microstates cycle between each other. So is there some sort of pattern in which microstates appear and then transition to other kinds of microstates?
So what are you thinking that these microstates are up to? What are some of the theories going on?
The microstates represent an aspect of the spontaneous brain activity that likely represents the very fast neural events within different nodes of these brain networks. And so each microstate is essentially a different, like a pulse within a different brain network that is active at different points in time. And so there's very interesting research trying to map these on to some of the work done in the functional magnetic resonance imaging literature, trying to identify where in the brain these particular microstates originate so that they can kind of merge these two literatures, work mapping the locations of different brain processes and cognitive processes, as well as this fast electrophysiological work and mapping the timing of these different processes. It's an aspect of spontaneous brain activity. They're so prevalent in the human EEG. The question is what function they serve in human cognition. But this is kind of an open question, but something my research is kind of pursuing. Is trying to understand the cycling of these different microstates and how they might contribute to attention and spontaneous thought and different content of thought.
Yeah, I mean, this is a terribly unscientific response to everything you've just said. But one thing that that I find fascinating when I hear about all of this research, especially these open questions, is it makes me kind of want to look into my own experience and look into my own mind and go like, like, what are my microstates doing? And, like, what is going on when I'm not aware of what's going on? Or what is my mind doing when I'm not trying to make it do anything, like focus on a task or something? And if I had to sort of guess, there might be something about like scanning the environment in a general sense, like awareness of environmental stimuli, like, oh, there was a sound, or, some spatial awareness, maybe. That feels like one piece that's probably always like humming, is just like some awareness of where I am in space and sound, like attentiveness to the environment, almost like an antenna being up or something.
That's a really good observation. We are embodied animals. We live in environments and we have things going on around us all the time. And so we're wired to take in information from our environment and interact with what's going on. And so one of the interesting dimensions that has been kind of identified in this research is kind of the distinction between kind of outwardly oriented attention and inwardly oriented, internally directed attention or internally directed cognition.
Yeah, I find it very helpful to hear the way that researchers think about these topics, such as yourself, because it has such a level of nuance, and also all these different phenomena of thinking are named and differentiated from each other. Maybe not in ways everybody agrees on in the world of research, but still as a practitioner, it's very helpful to kind of map on some of what I experience in my practice to some of what, is being articulated here. I feel like it refines my own understanding of my experience to learn about it. So we want to thank you very much for your time today, Tony. And if folks are interested in this research and learning more about what it's all about and some of your findings, what's the best way to find you or more about this work?
You can find me on Twitter at Anthony Zanesco. You can look up some of our work that's being done at the University of Miami at Dr. Amishi Jha's lab website. That is lab.amishi.com. And you can learn more about the Shaman Project and some of my collaborators at the University of California, Davis at Dr. Clifford Sarin's lab website. So that's sarinlab.ucdavis.edu. Sarin is spelled Saron.
Thank you. We'll put all of that stuff in our show notes, as well as some of the other references made over the course of our conversation. Thanks so much for your time. This was great, Tony. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.